Last time we looked at briefly how the followers of Kant were divided into two different schools of empiricism and rationalism. And Kant, and what was the difference between them? Although they stuck to the basic Cartesian insight about subjectivism, they they reacted differently to Descartes' ideas about the nature of that subjectivity or that subject or that I think. And Kant tried to reconcile or synthesize these two schools or these two groups of rationalism, and by this we mean only modern rationalism or Cartesian rationalism, and empiricism. And by empiricism also we mean Cartesian empiricism or Cartesian inspired empiricism. And Kant tried to reconcile them or synthesize them but he reconciled them or synthesized them, however you want to understand that, in such a way that it was revolutionary. And as we will see, in reconciling this and synthesizing these two different interpretations of Descartes, Kant also initiated something which was totally new, which was going beyond Descartes, even though going beyond Descartes, but without abandoning his basic subjectivism, his basic modernism, or whatever you want to call it. One way to look at it is to see what Kant accepts and what Kant rejects in these two schools. That is, what he accepts in empiricism, what he rejects in empiricism, what he accepts in rationalism, and what he rejects in rationalism. But if we look at what he accepts in each school, then the opposite of it would be mainly what he rejects in the other schools. So let's start with empiricism. As we said, Kant was actually educated in Leibnizian Wolffian rationalism. So he wasn't educated as an empiricist, but when Kant was growing up and when Kant was maturing, empiricist ideas were spreading in Germany as well. And as we saw in the last video, it was his reading of Hume especially, which according to Kant had awoken him from his dogmatic slumber. So it shook his faith in unadulterated Leibnizian Wolffian rationalism. And he had to rethink his commitment to rationalism. And so what he took from empiricism was eventually the idea that our mind or subject or Cartesian, I think, whatever you want to. These are all same thing at this point, although as we'll see, Kant will change that as well. So one thing which he took from empiricism was that this mind, this subject, this I think, doesn't give us information or content of our knowledge. And the content is provided by our senses. So the information comes to, I think, or mind or to the subject from outside. So unlike Descartes, unlike his rationalist followers, mind or subject doesn't provide any content, which is another way of saying that. Remember, we looked at innate ideas. So you have innate ideas, and we saw there were at least three senses in which Descartes talks about innate ideas. So powers of mind or structures, and the second was the mind's power to see, or Latin intuit, and innate ideas like God, etc. So among these three, I think they can't accept this, that there are powers of mind and potentialities of mind or structures of mind which are necessary for any knowledge. But he rejected this. So that was his great concession to empiricism. The mind doesn't have power to see. And so he said it in his famous formulation that mind without senses is empty, and senses without mind are blind. He did say that mind has power to create and generate ideas, but so Kant doesn't deny that our mind generates ideas like idea of God. But what Kant denies is that these ideas mind cannot tell us whether they correspond to reality or not. So our mind has lots of ideas, can generate ideas, but mind cannot tell us whether they correspond to reality or not. And the reason is that mind doesn't give us information or the content that can only be attained through senses. And the ideas whose referent or object is not to be found in the reality which we can perceive, we can't say whether those ideas have any corresponding reality or not. And Kant famously formulated this insight in his assertion that existence is not a predicate. So I can have an idea of $10, but that doesn't mean that I have $10 in my pocket, because existence is not a predicate, and mind cannot tell us whether something exists or not. That can be ascertained only through perception, sense perception. Okay. So these are a lot of concessions to empiricism, and if that's all Kant had done, then we wouldn't have been talking about Kant in this way, because once he has conceded all those points to empiricism, and people do, I think, remember, that he was influenced by Hume, and he was awoken from his dogmatic slumber by Hume. But what people sometimes forget is that Kant once said that his critique of pure reason was an apology for Leibniz. So we saw that he was educated as a sort of a Leibnizian rationalist, An apology for Leibniz means apology for rationalism. Thought in the face of empiricist challenge. And this is another way of saying that although he conceded a lot of ground for empiricism, he also take back some of it through his reformulation of Leibnizian rationalism. And that's the second point to which we should return, and that will tell us what he still retains from rationalism, and not just retain from rationalism, but after that concession he had to reformulate his rationalism in order to retain whatever he retains. So what does he retains from rationalism? What he retains is the idea of, and this is through his reformulation, and when I said that he accepts empiricist's claim that the information or content of knowledge comes from outside mind. So only senses can provide us the content of knowledge, and mind in that respect only has receptive power, that he is receptive. So mind in just receives the content from outside through senses. But this way of putting it is a bit lazy way of putting it. It's not precise. And although it's true that content comes through senses, and mind, and Kant's term for it is understanding. Receives that content through senses, so it doesn't provide actively anything in that. But this content comes to mind in unprocessed form. And it is one of the functions of mind or understanding is to process that information in the first place, or combine it in the first place. So if I'm looking at a table or a chair or a tree, I'm not meaning to draw these things, it's just a table, so senses are giving me information about these things, but senses are giving me unprocessed information. different impressions of color, of different qualities, secondary and primary. And this information is so unprocessed that senses don't give me even the concept of an object. So senses on their own don't give me any concept of the object tree, or the concept of the object table, or the concept of the object chair. Senses just give me unprocessed information about different aspect of what will become object when this information is processed by understanding. So although understanding is, or the mind is, receptive or inactive as far as the reception of these impressions of the external world through senses is concerned, mind is very active when it processes that information, combine that information in order to form different objects. So even the concept of object is provided by mind itself. Experience doesn't give us any concept of the object. So senses give us unprocessed content, and understanding then process that information at two levels. At two levels. First is the level of this information. It processed that information and combined them according to into representations of different. That's one. And second, that representation is then categorized by mind into different, to object, to subject, into cause, into effect, and all those categories. So mind combines the unprocessed information at two levels. The unprocessed content it combines into different representations, and then that representation is further categorized into or combined into different concepts and different categories. So on the one hand, as far as the content is concerned, Kant considers understanding as totally inactive or receptive or inert. But once it receives that content, it processes that information at two levels, combine them into representations and categorize them into different concepts. And this is pure activity. So he conceived the faculty of understanding of mind as activity or active faculty. And basically, the primary activity is that of judgment. It is through judgment that all the processes we talked about, the process of representation and the process of categorization is basically they are the function of or sub-function of the faculty of judgment or the activity of judging. So according to Kant, in order to have a knowledge of something, or for example, knowledge of a tree, to know anything, we need receptivity, and that happens through senses. We receive the content about the external world from outside. In fact, we don't even know the external world until this knowledge is processed. But this content is totally unprocessed. And understanding, which is an active faculty, which is activity itself, through its act of judging processes and combines this unprocessed information on two levels. First, it combines them into different folds and then it categorizes them. That's through concepts. That's what understanding does, and that's the faculty. It's an active faculty. In fact, it is called it spontaneity, freedom. Because when I judge, I show my freedom vis-a-vis the external world, through which I combine the information I receive in a different ways and make sense of them. But this knowledge, through combination and categorization, becomes the knowledge of the objective world. So in a sense, understanding itself creates this objective world and posits the objective world outside us through this process of combination and judging. But, and this is really the Kantian point, that's not enough. So we have unprocessed information, then it is processed by mind at different level, but still not knowledge, because in order to have knowledge, we also need to presuppose the unity of that activity of understanding, unity of subjectivity or mind or I think, because in order for that knowledge to be my knowledge, I must have some sort of unity. My mind must be presupposed as some sort of unity, otherwise that different information I'm getting from different senses can never be considered as my knowledge of the external world. So it's not just an active faculty which is required to have knowledge, but you also need to presuppose that active faculty is a unity. It is a self. It belongs to the subject, one subject. It belongs to one I. Even though we can't, as we will see in a minute, we can't actually know that I. This last point is connected to Leibniz in a very important way, because Leibniz had actually criticized Descartes. He had criticized Descartes for not taking into consideration in his I think perceptions which were this I think wasn't conscious of. And this is another way of saying that this I, or I think, has this unique characteristics that it doesn't just perceive things, but can also perceive that we perceive things. What I mean is, if I see a tree, for example, the tree is green. That's my perception. But I have the ability to also be conscious of my perceiving that I perceive that the tree is green. And this thing can go on. I perceive that I perceive the tree is green, and this can, I perceive that I perceive that I perceive. And there's no end to it. In other words, we not only have an ability to perceive, but what Kant following Leibniz called apperceive. So we don't only have a ability to perceive, but we also have ability to perceive that we perceive, and he called that apperceive. In other words, we have this unique ability of self-consciousness. And what Kant said following Leibniz was that this self-consciousness is essential for knowledge as well. Because if I cannot become, in principle, conscious of perceiving something, then that thing cannot enter into my repertoire of knowledge. So in order to have knowledge, I should be able be self-conscious of having that knowledge. And this self-consciousness, accordingly, for Kant, is the condition of the possibility of any knowledge. Without this self-consciousness, we can't have any knowledge. And even though we don't have access to this reality of this self-consciousness, this I should accompany in principle should be able to accompany in principle all our perceptions in order to become and Kant said we can't have knowledge of this I because in order to have knowledge, we need this I to accompany that knowledge in principle. And that will go on to infinite regress. But we must presuppose this I, this self-consciousness, in order for knowledge to be possible. And this was his apology for Leibniz, in a sense, because obviously Hume has said that there's no I really, and the only I is what we experience when we observe ourselves inward in a happenings, and what we see is different memories, different feelings, but no self. And Kant said that I, that self-consciousness, is beyond the reach of our knowledge, because it is the very possibility of having any knowledge. And when we try to focus on that I, it retreats. It retreats because I can always reflect on what I am perceiving at this moment. In other words, I can and must and should accompany all my perception. So when I say I am seeing a tree, I see that I am seeing a tree, and I see that I see that I am seeing. So this I always keep retreating, and that's why, according to Kant, this I is original. It is undrived. We can't perceive it because it will accompany any perception we have in order for that perception to be possible. So in that sense, it is original. It is underived, and at some point Kant also say it is mysterious because it keeps retreating. It never comes into we can't have a perception of it because it is always retreating, and in that sense it is original and mysterious. And this is also spontaneity because it's pure activity, and it is an activity which is grounded in itself. It is self-activity. What Kant calls Selbsttätigkeit, self-activity. In Critique of Pure Reason, I think it's B130. And that pure activity is basically freedom. So Kant, and here Kantian Revolution, rests in this insight. He's stuck to Cartesian I, but his I is not I think, but his I is pure activity, pure freedom. Mysterious freedom, which is not grounded in physical world because we can't have experience of it. If it was grounded in physical world, if it was a physical reality, or if it was a thing of this world, we should have been able to see it or perceive it, but it's always retreating. It's a mysterious thing. It's an activity. It's pure freedom. And the Kantian Revolution of the Cartesian Revolution consists in the fact that Descartes had said that I think is the most certain thing. And this, I think, through his concept of intellectual intuition, was related to knowledge and cognition. But Kantian I is not I think, it's pure activity. It's not thought. It is not knowledge. It's freedom. And a freedom which, as we saw, is the condition of the possibility of knowledge. Because without this freedom through which understanding, judge and act and process unprocessed information, knowledge would not have been possible. So that this is Kant's synthesis and Kant's revolution. I think we should stop here.